Oh yeah, got some congestion going on. What's up, everyone? This is Ryan here, and you are watching episode 37 of my live stream Q&A. So I do have to apologize today because I am a little bit sick, and that's kind of amusing because either last week or the week before I did this long ramble about taking vitamin D and exercising and trying not to stress your body out. And I kind of totally forgot to do that last week because last week was very hectic for me. And incidentally, I got a little bit sick. So I'm on the mend. It's just a basic cold, but if you see me blowing my nose or sniffling or whatever, unfortunately, that's basically what's going to be happening. But yeah, I've got an interesting episode planned today, so let's kind of get started. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon. So that's going to be Seth Keegan, Trevor Halvorsen, Bassam Halal, Tina Fredericks, Nanotech, Shadow, or A, my friend A, Mr. Bidwell, Graham Hertzeg, Sushil Chanda, Elad Stavi, Shoku Mostofi, Tomas, and hopefully I don't pronounce her last name improperly, but Juan Calle, I believe is how it's pronounced, but because I think in Spanish the double L is a Y-ish, but maybe you're not Spanish, so I might totally be messing that up. But to all those people, I say thank you very much for supporting me. It's much appreciated. If you like what I do and would like to see me do it better, and maybe would like to support the channel, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The easiest thing is if you just hit the like button down below and write a comment on any of my video contents any of my content that you like. And of course, the next thing is sharing it on your preferred social media platforms. And then if you are in a position where you would like to throw me a couple bucks, then you can do so on Patreon like those awesome people, or PayPal directly. So anyways, that's my commercial for the day. And I really have one announcement. So part of the reason why I was sick and stressed out and all that stuff is I will very, very likely be moving at the end of March. And one of my roommates has already moved out, and the internet account is in his name. So there's a chance I might lose internet for a period, which would make streaming rather difficult. So I'll keep everyone posted, and I won't totally lose the internet because I have my smartphone and all that crap. But basically what I'm saying here is there's actually a chance that I might not be doing live streams for the month of March and possibly the first little bit of April. And the reason for that would literally be because I don't have internet. So I'm going to try and avoid that, or at least stream as many Sundays as possible. But in the event that I, can't stream for a little while, understand that's one thing I will keep doing. Like, I'm going to keep doing the streams. But like I say, if I don't have an internet and I'm looking for a new place to live, unfortunately, you're going to have to cut me a little bit of slack there. So that's really my only announcement for today. And we've got kind of a big, interesting topic, which I'll get into in a moment. But first and foremost, I'd just like to say what's up, everyone, and we'll spend a moment in the chat here. Oh, I got so much crap going on here. So, looks like we got a couple people joining us. We got Thomas, SW, Joe, D Phoenix, the Phoenix, and Peter, Anthony, and S. So welcome to all you people. Thanks for joining me. So I've got a question on writing unit tests. So that's a great question, and that will be the first question that I ask. So what I'm going to do today, sometimes when I do the Q&As, I will just do questions for the whole period. Sometimes I'll do kind of a talk at the start, and every 10th episode of the Q&A is basically an off-topic discussion where I will talk about whatever the hell I want to talk about, and people can ask me whatever they want. Whether they get an answer, I cannot say, but you are allowed to ask me whatever you want. And so we're not quite on the 10th episode. We're still waiting for number 40. But I had a topic which is still very relevant to what we do as developers, but is a little more philosophical. So with that, I'm going to drink some coffee and we'll get started. All right. So here we go. And again, apologies if I'm sniffling and all kinds of crap. So here we go. So last week, a viewer of the stream, who happens to be a high school student, asked if I could address a couple of topics which are sort of seldom spoken of, and they kind of relate partly to the artistic and creative nature of writing code. Now that might sound a bit vague, but so is the definition of art when you really think about it. Anyways, this viewer, whom I will refer to as Jamie, also shared some of his input with me on the topic, and after I pressed him, or asked him to, Jamie kindly agreed to let me start this rambling session off with a quote of his, which was part of his message. So basically what I'm saying here is I have a viewer who's in high school, and I already know he's a pretty good programmer. He's totally moving in the right direction. And he wanted me to talk about, well, let me read his quote out, and then we'll kind of springboard from there. So this is a quote from Jamie, and thank you for sharing your thoughts, Jamie. So, begin quote. Computer programming is more than mere typing of seemingly arbitrary words on a computer screen. It is the chance for a human being to exert complete control over a computational system and to find a way to build something truly meaningful out of nothing. Through clean and functional structure, computer code, at its essence, can be crafted into a powerful marvel that is at its very core not only beautiful, but remarkably elegant as well. End quote. And with that, I say to you, Jamie, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I can already tell you're thinking about these things in a sort of abstract and fundamental way, and I think your desire to understand things in that way will serve you very well. So keep doing what you're doing, man. So Jamie's quote wasn't the entirety of the message he sent me. He sort of gave me a number of related topics to kind of riff on, and what I'll do now is I will try and give my thoughts on sort of the different things that he brought up. And basically the anchor point of this discussion is talking about writing elegant code. And let me just increase the font size here. Hopefully that'll probably change my other notepad thing. No? Okay, great. Okay. Way too many equal signs. So, writing elegant code. So that's kind of after the fact what I decided to name this rambling session. Sorry, I've got a lot of stuff open and things to cover here. So the first thing I wanted to do is Jamie mentioned a number of things in his message and also in the quote that have to do with partly an artistic quality of code and partly a creative sort of quality and partly, well, just a couple different things. And so I was trying to decide on an entry point into this discussion. And the thing I arrived at, I ended up looking up a definition of the word elegant, and it turns out it describes what I want to talk about fairly well. So the first, what I'm going to open with is, I realize that some of my viewers are ESL, so I'm going to start with sort of a typical English language definition of elegance. And let me make sure I'm got the screen ready here. So after consulting the Oracle, Wikipedia, this is what we get for a simple definition of elegance. And there's really three parts here that I noticed immediately. So for starters, we have an element of beauty, or I'm going to rephrase that a little, maybe an element of something that can be appreciated. Beauty is sort of I think beauty more in the sense of when you're looking at like, you know, a mountain range or something, like an intrinsic quality of attractiveness, I guess. And then we have an element of effectiveness and an element of simplicity. So those are kind of the three starting points that I was thinking about. Okay, well, what does it mean to write elegant code, and how can we kind of get started? So the entry point here is going to be writing elegant code. And from this definition, what I wanted to open with is to sort of examine each part of this definition. And the first part of this definition, and don't worry, we will get to talking about code, this is all about code, is effectiveness. So when we're creating something, I basically tried to think, okay, well, how do we kind of define effectiveness pertaining to code? So number one, I thought about this for a while, and my baseline standard for something to even enter into the realm of effectiveness is that it must work. It must do the thing. Now, I'm deliberately simplifying this here. So before we can even really get into effectiveness, at the bare minimum, we have a piece of code that must do a thing. And that's really, so if the code does not do the thing, we don't even really need to talk about effectiveness, in my opinion. So what are some examples? Does your database actually persist data across instances of an application? So you've got a file called a database. Does it actually do the thing? Second example, does calling setText on a widget in a fragment actually change the UI? Or does it throw a null pointer exception? So what I'm trying to do is just trying to establish the baseline here. So before we even get to talking about effectiveness further, that's my baseline sort of discussion. So then I kind of ask the question, okay, so that's our baseline. So how can we compare the effectiveness of different units of code? So let's take an example. So we have one problem solved by two different units of code. One unit is exactly twice the line numbers of the other, and they both meet the baseline requirement. So you're probably asking, okay, so what is a unit of code? And a unit, what I'm saying here is sort of analogous to like grams or kilograms. Like we could be talking about a method, we could be talking about a class, we could be talking about a module, we could be talking about a project. So we're just talking, we have a unit that has a problem to solve. So at the highest level, we could say a note-taking app. The problem is being able to take notes. So that's kind of like the entry point here. So we've got two units of code that basically do the same thing, and we're just going to assume that they're, you know, on the same platform, and there isn't anything really weird going on that would force one unit to be twice the size of the other. So from that, where we go is without any weird, I'll say weirdness involved, it's fairly safe to say that the smaller unit that does the same thing is more effective in a mechanical sense. We're literally getting the same thing done with less effort, less lines of code. So by a very mechanical sense, that is fewer line numbers or lines of code that a computer needs to sort of interpret to do the same thing. So that's kind of one metric by which we can sort of think about code effectiveness. But then I ask the question, okay, well, what might be a scenario where so let's take that same example. We've got two units of code. One's this big, the other's this big. And they do the same thing. What could be a scenario where the larger unit of code could be arguably more effective than this other one, which we've already kind of said in a mechanical way, this thing over here is a little more efficient. And when I thought about this, I thought about the human element of writing code, which leads me to my next point. And it's a long one, so I have to read from it. So Since applications are really a team effort between humans and computers, at least until the computers take over, which I'm only half joking there, we can't discount the human element. So what if the smaller unit was written in a way which was unintelligibly vague and convoluted? Ultimately, the computer isn't going to care, but the people who need to read and maintain the code certainly will. In fact, if a large enough amount of time is wasted in deciphering the code in the smaller unit, the unit twice the size reads so easily that you don't have to guess about what a single line does, then I would take the larger unit. So let's take a quick break from philosophy and talk about something practical. So in just about every unit of code I've written in the past 2 years, I've tried very hard to make it easy to read. Part of this is because as somewhat of a teacher, even though I don't really like to call myself that, I know many people will be looking at my code. That being said, I started this practice of legible code because I saw firsthand what happens when you half-ass names and separation of concerns. Now, I'm not going to ramble too much about separation of concerns here, but just understand that when you have one big thing that needs to do 5 things, it's hard to think of a name for it unless those things are super closely related. Whereas if you have that same list of requirements, 5 things that needs to be done, and you separate it into 5 different objects, it becomes easier to name each object because each object has a narrower definition and concern. So just a practical tip there for separation of concerns. Anyways, that's not the primary thing I wanted to ramble about here. So let me just find my place. So anyways, as a general rule, and I brought this up in some discussion earlier today with some of the developers on the Slack channel. So this is kind of my general rule, and I'm not going to say this is the best thing. I want to put this out there and hear other people's opinions, because there will be differing opinions. But as a general rule for me, I will prefer a long and descriptive name for a class or function or variable over a shorthand name that's hard to read or an obscure name, but most importantly over a shorthand name. Now, why is that sort of better for me, and why would I prefer that? 2 reasons. Number one, I talked about the fact that other people read my code, so they don't necessarily know my shorthand. So there's an element where if you're the only person working on a particular project, and you're the only person who's going to read it, yeah, use your shorthand, absolutely. But one of the problems I ran into, and this is a practical concern, is that earlier on when I was building Android apps in the beginning, I didn't separate my concerns. So things were very hard to name, and one method, instead of having one method that makes use of helper methods to do what it needs to do, so I would have like one big method with an obscure name that does a whole bunch of different things. I would have one big object that does a whole bunch of different things. And so the problem with that, as I mentioned, is that it's hard to name that thing, but there's a second issue which particularly is an issue for me. I don't have a very good memory for obscure details. And what I found is, back then when I used to code like that, I would come back to a class or a method that I had written as little as 2 weeks before, and I would have to spend time relearning what it did. And I would even have situations where I would read a change I made, and I would say to myself, I can't figure out what this does. And then I would delete it. And then after thinking about the problem for a couple hours, I would suddenly realize, oh, that's why I did that thing I just deleted. All because it was hard to read and understand what was going on. So anyways, what I'm trying to do here is basically make a practical appeal. There's a degree where shorthand is fine, But one of the problems with cutting corners on making your code legible is not only that you make the people who read your code suffer, but you will make yourself suffer because you will have to spend extra time relearning what you do. So you might think you're saving time by having one method that does 10 things instead of one method with 9 helper methods that have a clear name and do one thing. But in reality, you're going to be losing time potentially relearning your own code. I don't have that issue anymore because my code is super... I pull everything out and I try to give everything a good name, and it's just sort of a non-issue anymore because I've separated everything and I'm such a stickler about giving things good names. And so anyways, this second part is sort of an appeal to legibility and sort of an artistic quality of writing code, which is that it's not just... Yeah, we can talk about effectiveness as a better solution to the same problem. So less lines of code to solve the same problem. That's one element of this. But another element of this is if your code is unintelligible, I would argue that is a great reduction in its effectiveness. So anyways, that's kind of where I'll leave that point there. And let's see where I move on to next, because I'm trying to string together some pretty vague ideas. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, I've mentioned it, I've covered it a couple different ways, but I want to talk about, so why should you strive for elegant code? So I've talked about some very practical things, and I wanted to share an example with you. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of the developers of this, and they've actually totally admitted that there are some issues with it, but a while ago my friend Darrell mentioned that there is an application out there, which I just checked it recently. It has over 100 million downloads, and the code for it is essentially... Let me just show you one snippet of this code. So this is a chat application, and this entire application... Let me just take you to the this main package here. We'll see if I can find it. Like, just have a quick look. So this is the basic structure of this application. So this entire application, which has all these different packages and tools and all these different things, so I'm told, has 3 activities. Let's look at one of those activities. Chat activity. Just bear with me. I gotta have a sip of coffee. Oh, we got to the method declaration. Or the class declaration. I'm so good with those names. Oh. Oh. Okay. Okay. Oh, we're still looking at variables. Oh. Okay. We've got a interesting little sort of anonymous thing going on. Yeah, I think you get the point. Let me just... So notice where this thing is. I'm just going to drag this scroll bar. Do you see what's going on here? This is one file. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here, I totally understand. Look, you can build an application which is financially successful and downloaded by hundreds of millions of people, and you don't necessarily... I'm not saying this is the worst code I've ever seen. It certainly isn't. Not at all. But in terms of the aesthetic quality and the structure of it, I've never seen anything quite like this. So the point I'm trying to get at here is, like, look, I'll totally admit there's a degree to which all of this artistic stuff, you don't need it in the most absolute sense to write good code. So why should we bother then. And I have mentioned it does give you some practical benefits. The separation of concerns and naming and all that stuff, legibility. So why should you strive for elegant code? And don't worry, I'm almost done my rambling. So, as I said before, obviously I can't say that it is mandatory to make your code elegant in order to succeed. But there's something which has always driven me to try and write my code a little bit better every time the opportunity presents itself. And that thing is called having appreciation and respect for your craft. What happens when you appreciate and respect your craft? You will always try to improve. Number one, because you will actually care about the quality of your work at a very deep level. Number two, when you come across other people's code that is truly elegant, I almost said arrogant, elegant, you respect the person who made that code because you know what it takes to write elegant code. It isn't easy, and it requires constant assessment and learning and refinement. The easy path is to not care. That's the easy thing to do. And the third point is that as someone who cares about what you create, what they create, you will tend to attract the best teammates, employers, and you will have far more leverage in selecting your clients as a developer. And that's because there is no shortage of work for those who are the best in their respective fields, unless your field is tic-tac-toe or something like that. But what I'm saying here is, and this is something that I built this entire thing on, is if you are just good enough at what you do, all the degrees, all the titles, all the certifications is somewhat irrelevant to the fact that what we are craftsmen, craftspeople, craftswomen of software. And this is something that Uncle Bob kind of talks about quite a lot. So that's kind of my appeal, the more emotional side of why I think you should try and respect your craft and try to do a good job. Try to make it legible and easy for other people to understand, or easy for you to understand. Try to make your code more effective whenever you can. And, you know, just really take that as something which can apply to so many different areas of life, really. So anyways, in any case, all I wanted to do here is share some of my thoughts on what it means to be proud of what you create, some tools to help others appreciate your work, and for you to learn to appreciate the work of others, and to borrow a phrase from Robert Martin, to make a statement that we are software craftspeople, craftsmen, craftswomen. The better we are at our craft, like Jamie mentioned in his quote, the better we can harness the power of these machines to take lines of code and turn them into things that are absolutely amazing and practical and wonderful. And those things, if you try hard enough, can read like a book. When you open a project that has proper separation of concerns and everything has a good name, it's a pleasure, because you understand how difficult that is and what it's like to try and decipher God object spaghetti code piles of crap. So those are my thoughts. I offer these reflections. I'm not trying to make absolute statements of reality here, but I'm just trying to offer you some reflections in the hopes that even if you didn't agree with everything I said, perhaps I gave you something to think about. So that is my ramble for today on elegant code. I didn't really get to talk about all of the things that Jamie brought up in his message, but hopefully this was good enough, and hopefully this was something useful to the viewers. So I'm going to shut the hell up, drink some coffee, run a quick commercial break, and then we will dive into Q&A. Okay, just waiting for the ad to finish there. So, right off the bat, I had a question about writing unit tests. So let's talk about unit testing. So, I'm kind of rephrasing this question a little bit. I'm just going to note the time here. So that's going to be right around the 31-minute mark. 30:01. Holy crap. Anyways. Oh, I'm crazy. 31 minutes. Sorry, for those watching, I just forgot how to write 31 minutes for a moment there. So, anyways. As you can see, I care very strongly about whether people think I'm smart or not. So let's get started here. So this question, I'm rephrasing it a little. So Phoenix asks, could you talk about writing unit tests and isolating units of code for testability? And I certainly can. So before we get there, I kind of explained this in my long rambling, but this was the first sticking point for unit testing. And I always like to mention this whenever I talk about unit tests. We're talking about a unit of code. This can be, you know, it can be a function, it can be a variable, it can be a class, it could even be like a whole module. When we say unit, the reason why we use this word unit is we're talking about something of variable size. So now the problem is you probably don't really, in my opinion so far, most of the time you're going to want to be testing functions. At least that's what I've found to be the most effective thing. And there's different ways to test that, but you're asking sort of a more specific question. So let's jump into code, and I'll leave this rambling and stuff. So what are we going to look at here? Let's do... Maybe I'll jump to a couple different projects. Let me just open some test classes up here. Okay. So how do we kind of write a unit test? And what is our goal? So first and foremost, let's start with just mechanically, how do we sort of set up a unit test? And then there's another part which you mentioned, Phoenix, which was, I think what you were getting at is like, how do you actually set up your code so that it's easy to test? Like, how do we make objects that are easy to test? But first and foremost, just to actually set up a unit test, here's the general typical approach. And I generally tend to include this in most of my open source projects, but I've got lots of repositories down below. This repository is the Android REST tutorial repository. So this is my general step-by-step process for setting up a unit test. So the first thing we do is we set up mocks/test data, or we set up, I would actually rephrase this now. I would say set up test doubles and set up test doubles and test data. So this generally includes faking the responsibilities from the tested class's dependencies. So in this particular unit testing class here, this test class, we're testing a presenter. So let me just open up list. Oh, it's right there. Perfect. It looks like, yeah, I think I was messing around with it. What the hell is this crap? Oh well, whatever. So, what the hell did I do? See, this is a problem. I come in and change things, and then I come back here and then forgot that I changed them because I'm an idiot. So, what did I actually... Yeah, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Android REST tutorial? Whatever. This is a problem when you look at code you haven't looked at in like a month. So, whatever. We've got... These are the things that this presenter talks to. a view, a data source, and we don't really need to bother about this RxJava stuff at the moment. So these are the things that our unit, our object that we're testing. So just as a general tip, I will generally write a test class for a whole object, and then within this test class, I will test as many methods of the class that I think is appropriate to the situation. So within livestream, it talks to this view and this data source. So the first thing I'm going to say to myself is, okay, I'm going to need to fake these things. I'm going to need to pass in test doubles into this presenter. And that's going to allow me to write the tests. So in the unit test class, I create a real version of the object I want to test. I create a real presenter, but I give it test doubles. So in this case, I'm using Mockito. You could pass in, there's a bunch of unit testing jargon like fakes and mocks and stuff, and you can maybe Google, you can check out like, what's the difference between fake, mock, spy. I would call all of these test doubles. And the problem here is that these words pretty much mean the same thing in English, so this is kind of a tricky thing, but anyways. So we set up our test doubles, and we pass in our test doubles to the class we want to test. Then we set up, as I said in step 1, we set up the doubles and the data, and we prepare our fake objects for the test. And the way that we do that, for example, in Mockito, is we say when our presenter calls this method on this fake, return this data. I know this is all RxJava stuff. Don't bother about it. Just understand this is what we're returning when our presenter asks the data source for repositories. We don't need to worry about all this flowable thing. It's just irrelevant. So, and why we had to do that, why I decided that I needed to sort of prepare that test item, is because I know this method, this unit that I'm testing, which is when get repositories, the method, is successful, we're going to call this method on the presenter, and so I'm testing a situation where our data source successfully returns the data. So hopefully that's fairly self-evident here. I realize there's some libraries and stuff which might make this code a little obscure. So we call the method, this is step 2. Execute the method to be tested with the real version of the class to be tested. So call the unit you want to test. So step 3 is where we start to actually test things. So step 3, we assert 2 things. There's different ways you can approach your assertions. So when testing, you can assert, among other things, maybe not. I'm not sure if this is all inclusive now that I think about it, but let's say possibly among other things, you want to assert, you can assert behavior and state. So those are the main things that we actually want to know out of the thing that we're testing is, did it behave the way I wanted it to? And we can also check what it does to objects it creates or we pass into. So for example, what is the best way to test a unit which works on a single kind of object, like a plain old Java object or a data class in Kotlin or some like object that describes the problem domain? So like, what is the best way to test a create note unit? When you ask it to create the note, does it return a note to you? So that's like state verification. And we're also kind of verifying behavior as well. So anyways, let's return to code. So generally what I'm looking for with my assertions is either, so I want to check, let me translate this first. So mockito.verify, we're saying verify that the view, the fake view, had this method called with this value. Now in this particular case, all I want to know is that some list was passed into this method. I don't even need to know what the values are. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. I just want to know this thing was called. And so this is essentially, we're more so verifying behavior and not so much concerned about the state. So that's kind of mechanically how you would write unit tests, how I suggest writing unit tests. Now, if you're into RxJava and Kotlin, let me show you just a brief example. There's a lot of stuff you can do. So for example, in this particular case, let's see, where do I have a, no, not that one. What do we got here? Yes, so here is an example. So this is the Kotlin calculator, Kotlin MVP calculator project down below. So in this particular case, what we can do is when we're working with, say, RxJava, which is a little more complicated, we could set up like a test subscriber and then test things through, for example, checking what our, in this case, we have an object we want to test, and what it does is it emits values. And so here we have this test subscriber that can verify the state again of what this object emits. So anyways, the point I'm trying to get at here is there's different tools you can use, and it's going to depend on your platform and what you actually want to test. But generally it revolves around what does this thing do and what does it do to the objects it creates or the objects I pass into it. So that's that. The last thing I'll talk about here is how do we make our code easier to test? How do we actually have units that are testable? So the number one principle, and this is one of the strongest arguments for separation of concerns, which I talk about all the time, is that it is easier to test 5 objects that do one thing than one object that does 5 things as a general rule in most cases. And the reason why is that something which is smaller is easier to test. Hopefully that's fairly unambiguous. Maybe there's special edge cases there. But what does that actually mean? So there's 2 things I'm going to recommend, 2 principles which will help you write tests. 2 principles which will help you write tests. Number 1, separation of concerns, which is a way of saying don't make God objects. That's really what don't do God objects. Separate your architecture, separate your methods, separate your units. And number 2, and this is a subtle point, which is very key, code to an interface. Why do we need to code to an interface? This is very key. If this is the first time you've heard of this and you're not familiar with loose coupling, Google that. You're going to want to know what loose coupling is because it's very important for architecture. What does coding to an interface do? When we have a unit that we would like to test, if its dependencies, the thing that it talks to, are interfaces, then we don't need the real thing during the test. We can pass in a fake version because what we're passing in is only known to the object we're testing as an interface. So to make a concrete point, this presenter talks to an interface. These are interfaces. And because of that, during testing, we can put a fake thing behind the interface, and during production, we can put the real thing behind the interface. And as long as both the fake thing and the real thing conform to the interface, we can test our presenter and be confident that it works the way we want it to. So those are my 2 majorly key points here to promote testable code is separation of concerns and code to an interface. And these are both broad topics, but I just want to give you like some big kind of signposts. This is your destination, and good luck with separation of concerns because it's a big topic. So anyways, I'm going to be rude and blow my nose for a moment, and then we'll get to another question. Okay. So let's hop into chat. So that was unit testing. Oh, interesting. That's a quick one. Let me answer this right away. Why didn't it? Oh, that was the whole thing. 46. Okay, so where are we at here? Live dashboard. Yep, so this is a very quick, I'll answer this just very quickly. So SWS, can we use room? So room is an SQLite annotation-based database from Android architecture components. And so to answer your question, room is a tool. Sorry, excuse me, I've got something sort of stuck in my throat here. So room is a tool. It's really just a database. So it's basically separate from your architecture. So now I understand probably where you're kind of what you're thinking about here, because Google, the Android team recommends that they suggested in their guide to app architecture that you use ModelView ViewModel, and live data, ViewModel, and room. They all play nicely together. Now, you do not need to use room expressly with ModelView ViewModel, and I could really go off on a big tangent here, but what someone says when they mean ModelViewPresenter and when they mean ModelView ViewModel is probably not quite as different as you think it is. In this particular case, what it really relates to is the way the view talks to the thinking part of your front-end architecture. And I could go into pictures and stuff, but just suffice it to say that if you wanted to use room with ModelViewPresenter, you really just treat room like a model. And in fact, you basically would treat it the same way in either architecture. And so what just to summarize, what ViewModel is really all about, the architecture, not necessarily the class from Android architecture components. What ViewModel is all about is the view talking to a view model, but the view model doesn't know expressly about the view. Instead, it just publishes data. So the view can talk to the view model, but the view model can't directly talk back to the view. Instead, the view model, when the view model detects a change in the database through live data or something, it's going to get that change and it's going to be like, it's just going to publish that result to whoever's listening, and it's not going to say, hey view, here's the data. It's just going to be like, somebody look at this data. Whoever is observing, look at the data. So that's basically what ViewModel is. So the difference between ModelViewPresenter and ModelView ViewModel at a really fundamental level is that ModelViewPresenter kind of tells the view directly what to do. That's basically, in a nutshell, what the difference is. And so that's why you can use room with any architecture. It's independent of architecture in a sense. It's just Google kind of recommends and is really pushing for ModelView View Model, and I have opinions on that, but I'm not really going to share them right now because I complain about ModelView View Model enough. So hopefully that answers your question. All right. I've got a lot of questions, so just give me a moment here. A lot of good questions today. Thank you. Let me just run a quick commercial break. I've got a bunch of questions, and it'll just be dead air for a moment anyway, so... Can you also have your... Interesting. So I've got a... I can't really give a... This is a new question. I don't know if I'll actually be able to answer it at all, but maybe we can open this up to some of the other... I know we've always got a couple senior devs listening, so... Joshua asks... Can you also have your test class subclass the presenter you want to test? So I've never thought about why, and I haven't even thought if there is a reason why you would want to do that. So let's hop into code. And so what you're... So we've got our presenter, and so the question you're asking is, can we say extends... The thing I'm wondering is, why do you want to do that? I don't immediately see why you would want to subclass the class you're testing. So basically this is... Why would I want to do this? So it's going to inherit the methods, but not really. Yeah, I don't really know. I'll have to think about that one. That's a totally new... I don't immediately see why you would want to, but I understand the question. Can you think of a particular reason why you might want to do that? Because that's a totally new... Yeah. Anyways, yeah, I don't know why you would want to do that, but it appears to be possible in the, but I don't know why. I've never done that before, and I don't think you would want to do that, because then as you change your presenter, it might affect your test class, which when you have a situation where changing one thing affects the other thing, that's generally a rule that you've got like a... What I'm saying here is, if you did that, it would increase the coupling between your test class and your presenter. So my question would be, why, if there's no immediate benefit to doing that, I would suggest you don't do that. But I haven't really thought about that. Anyways, interesting discussion point. Someone asked, can I tell the main difference between ModelViewPresenter and ModelViewController? And my answer is no, I cannot, because what ModelViewPresenter originally meant and what it means to every different developer nowadays has totally changed. So I don't actually really talk about ModelViewController very much, because it's just not something which has a single well understood definition. Now you can kind of say the same about ModelViewPresenter, and you can definitely say that about ModelViewViewModel, but I find ModelViewPresenter is the least ambiguous. But to be perfectly honest, what is the actual difference between ModelViewPresenter and ModelViewController? My answer to that is I don't actually really care, because there doesn't appear to be a strong difference. They both separate at the fundamental level user interface, logic, data. So when we're talking about ModelViewPresenter or ModelViewController, all I really think of is UI, logic, data. Now, probably in the chat, some people are going to say, oh, I'm going to give you a specific definition and difference between the two. And my rebuttal to that would be, okay, you have your definition of ModelViewController and ModelViewPresenter, which you probably just picked up from some random article. And that's not necessarily going to square up with all the other 500 definitions of ModelViewController or the other 500 definitions of ModelViewPresenter on the web. So what I'm trying to say is, even if I could explain to you in a concrete way, it's so annoying that I don't even want to. And instead, what I would encourage to everyone listening who's trying to understand what is ModelViewPresenter, what is ModelViewController, what is ModelViewViewModel, stop trying to think of a super concrete definition of each thing. Understand, what are we actually doing here without all the names and jargon? We're saying separate UI, logic, data. Just take that as your starting point. Yes, we can get into specifics, like there are differences between them. It's just, if you haven't seen an example of each, you don't really... What I found at first is when I was trying to learn software architecture, I was trying to just nail down very concrete definitions, because that's how my brain works. I want a clear definition of everything, which leads me to a lot of trouble. And with these architecture things, what I want you to focus on is separation of concerns. That's the whole point. Separation of concerns. I have an article which I talk about this, and if anyone is curious, the article is called WTF Does ModelViewPresenter Actually Mean? And I talk about 3-layer architectures and why we bother to do it. So you should check that article out. I think I have a link in the description box below. If not, I will post it here. I just posted it in the chat. Oops, I accidentally hit the recording button on OBS Studio, so I was streaming and recording. That's ugly. Okay, so, yeah, let's move on. So I'm not going to stay on for too much longer because my voice is kind of starting to fail here, but let's see what else. Since we're really into architecture today, so I might as well just stick to what I know here. So Swapnil asks, makes a statement, why ModelViewPresenter as a presenter is not architecture component. So I don't think this is an accurate statement. You can use ModelViewPresenter with all of architecture components. You can build a ModelViewPresenter architecture using ViewModel, live data, all this stuff. In fact, let me show you something really quickly here. In my ModelViewPresenter, and I'm almost not even going to call it that anymore for this exact reason, but if you go to my ModelViewPresenter Kotlin calculator project, link in the description box below, what you will see is that I have a presenter, I have a view, and I have data, which is basically model. When you hear people say model, it generally has to do with data. But I also have a view model. So people might look at this and mistakenly assume that I'm using ModelViewViewModel and ModelViewPresenter, And in a sense, I kind of am, but actually, I'm not using ViewModel the way it is typically used in a ModelViewModel architecture. This ViewModel object here within my ModelViewPresenter architecture is just another part of the model. It just happens to be part of the model which is lifecycle aware. So I store my application's temporary state there instead of storing it in the view or the presenter. So I totally forgot where I was going. What was the actual question? I totally forgot. I know it has to do with this stuff. So what I'm saying here is maybe the question was like, why didn't Android choose ModelViewPresenter as their flagship architecture or whatever? I couldn't really answer that exactly why, but the thing about it is, again, Google came out and said that they recommend, I always say Google, I should say the Android team came out and recommended ModelView ViewModel architecture, and but that doesn't mean you can't use ModelViewPresenter. It doesn't mean that it's going to solve world hunger and all your coding problems if you use this over this. There's, to quote Don Felker and Kaushik Gopal from Fragmented Podcast, there's no silver bullet architecture. Don't look for the perfect 3-layer architecture. Like I said before, look at each thing, separate the concerns, and approach it from what makes sense. So why did I include a view model in my ModelViewPresenter architecture? Because I needed a temporary storage place for application state. So at that point, I'm far removed from ModelView ViewModel architecture. It's just unfortunate that the class that I'm using to do that is called ViewModel. Now, no, I won't complain about the word ViewModel today. I won't. Anyways, moving on. I'm going to call it a day pretty quick here. So Mayor says that ModelView ViewModel is just common for most use cases. That's debatable. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I don't actually think that ModelView ViewModel is the most common architecture at all. I understand maybe what you're saying is it's fairly flexible, and I would not actually say that ModelView ViewModel is a better general purpose architecture than, say, ModelViewPresenter. But again, the problem is I have my definition of MVVM and MVP, and that might be different from your definition. So it's one of these things where we can't even really have an argument here because I can't be certain who's defining what as what. So that's the big issue with all these different jargon terms. Anyways. Someone's asking me, please explain ModelViewPresenter view model with Dagger and RX Java, and you're asking for a lot. Yeah, there's just you're asking me to just like literally describe my entire way of building apps, and it's just maybe ask that again another episode, but I'm gonna wrap this up pretty quick here. So good question, but oh, Mayor says he'll argue with me when I have much more experience. Well, you know what, if you're gonna phrase it like this, I'm totally fine not having a discussion with you at all. Because there's this thing called mutual respect, and obviously you don't think I'm very experienced, and you have your definition of experience, but if you're going to phrase it like that, whatever, man. Have fun being an expert. Oh, sorry. I apologize. Mayor said I can argue with you when you have much more experience. He said it was a typo. He said can't. So that's okay. That was a misunderstanding. So not my fault, because what Mayor said was that he was on a higher level of experience and therefore we couldn't have an argument, which I hate it when people say that, because it's not about your experience, it's about your arguments. But that's not actually what he said, so I apologize. We're totally cool, man. It's all good. Sorry. Oh, man. Well, my point is, it's not about who knows better. It's about the way I try and approach these things is I never think of myself as an expert. That's not relevant to me. What I care about is, are my arguments correct? And is my code good? And so if I were to, it's not that I disrespect people who have degrees or are senior developers and I think, oh, I know more than this person. Totally the opposite. But I do think the most important thing is what I say and my code, and the experience level. We're all going to learn at different levels. But anyways, that's totally not what he meant, so we're cool, and I'll move on. That was pretty funny. Oh, man. Sorry, you brought out the Ryan that is not so friendly and nice, that had to work in kitchens and construction sites and call out people when I get disrespected, so... Anyways. What else have we got here? I'm going to... one thing, so Joe is mentioning maybe use a different name for... maybe use a different name for this view model class, and the reason I really wanted to call this something different, but the class it extends is Android Architecture Components View Model. And I can't change that because I want to extend that class. So essentially, even though I don't want to call this thing view model, even though it basically is a view model, it's a model of the view state, my hand is forced. Because if I go and call this something else, people are going to read it and be like, well, this thing extends view model. So I can't really win. You know what I mean? Like, even if I call this something... view state container or something, it's still going to extend view model, and because I need that life cycle awareness, and yeah, it's just an annoying situation. I should probably still call it something different, but I haven't really decided on it. Anyways. Krunal is asking, do I have a... That's an interesting question. What are we at here? One. Approximately. Kunal asks, do you have a Dagger... an easy intro to Dagger for beginners? My friend, Dagger is not really for beginners. What I would suggest to you, and I wish I had a tutorial on this right now, but I just haven't had time to build it. But my suggestion is there are videos out there on Dagger. If you're an absolute beginner, let me show you some code, and let me just kind of softly introduce you to dependency injection, because Dagger is, of course, a tool to achieve dependency injection. So in the description box below, you'll find a project called Kotlin MVP Calculator, and in the package structure, you will see a package called dependency injection. In that class, you will see a handwritten dependency injection implementation. So as a starting point to dependency injection, I would suggest you look at this kind of thing so you actually understand what is Dagger doing. This is the kind of thing, in a way, that Dagger generates for you. Now, the problem with Dagger is that it is not easy to learn. There are some tutorials out there which make it easier, but the problem with Dagger 2 is that even if you understand what it does, there is a difference between writing a Dagger 2 implementation for a big project and writing like this kind of code. So I generally like to think of it like, as an example, if what I'm showing you here, this thing is a saw, like hopefully the tool, SAW, a saw. Dagger 2, let me show you some pictures actually, that's a better, easier way of talking about this. Just give me one moment. Why can't I? Just want to view the friggin' image. Why did Google take out the feature to just look at the image? This is new. Weird. Sorry, I'm so used to jumping on Google Images and then I can like right click and say view image, or I can have an option here, but it looks like they've actually changed this recently. Anyways, whatever. Just give me one moment here. Okay, and yeah, so here's my little example here. So if what I showed you is a saw, which has the job of cutting wood or dependency injection, this is Dagger 2. do you see what I'm saying here? Like, yeah, it's still a saw, but you're gonna have attachments and you're gonna be able to like, you're going to be able to build houses pretty quickly. It's just you need to know how to use this thing, because if you don't know how to use Dagger 2, then you'll be cutting your hand off. So anyways, what I would suggest to you, first, understand what dependency injection is. It's a very simple concept. It's literally as simple that a child could understand. I'll write out a definition and leave this question there. This is my definition for, God damn it, here we go. This is my definition for dependency injection. Okay, so dependency injection. Object does not create its own dependencies. Instead something else gives object its dependencies. This is dependency injection. It's not more complicated than this. And what does this mean in code? This means instead of this presenter class, instead of this class creating the view, creating the data source, those things are given to it. So what I'm kind of saying here is when you have a constructor and you give an object its dependencies through the constructor, that is dependency injection. That is giving an object its dependencies instead of object creating its own dependencies. And then we can get into Dagger implementation, which I won't today because it's pretty complicated, but at some point. All right, that's going to be pretty much it for complicated questions, so I'll stick around for a moment and chat. But yeah, so what did everyone... I know we had some varying opinions on what I talked about at the start of this episode, which I expected. I know not everyone likes Ryan just doing long-winded rambling about philosophical stuff, but I don't really care. So if I want to talk about something, I'll probably talk about it. And it was relevant to coding, so I just wanted to ask, like, Yeah, any thoughts on the stuff we talked about today? Talk to me. As I continue to be sick. All right. God, that was so funny. I totally misunderstood what Mayor was saying because of a typo. So just 2 points. So Taha is asking, what is the default architecture for Android? It's going to be either ModelViewPresenter or ModelViewViewModel. I would say before Android architecture components came out, I would say quite definitively ModelViewPresenter, and there's still a lot of people which prefer ModelViewPresenter. But also, as you can see, Android has really thrown their weight behind ModelViewViewModel. So I can't tell you which is the default, but it's going to be one of those two. This person mentioned that on iOS, the default is ModelViewController. It's going to be a 3-layer architecture, pretty much. Good. The young fellow who asked the question, asked me to talk about what I talked about at the start, apparently it was useful for him, so I'm really happy about that, because that was kind of the whole point. So that's good to hear, man. What else have we got here? Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty much it. Let's see. Thomas had a question. So Thomas was kind of asking, did his question come through? And so the problem is, Thomas, as you can see, I tend to give long-winded answers because that's the way I think and talk. And so I don't always get to every question. So I'll have a quick look here, but if it's a big question, I can't answer every question, unfortunately, but I will look and see if I even got it. Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. To answer, I can answer this. I would like to go into detail on this, but I can tell you've already got the understanding where I don't actually need to go into detail. So, Thomas was asking. One sec. I said I wasn't going to answer any more questions, but oh well. I lied. This is an Arnold Schwarzenegger quote. What are we at here? Wow, 118. I have been babbling today. So Thomas asks, or states he's read a little bit about clean architecture. Do I use RxJava to be kind of the pipeline between the data layer and the presenter? And you're saying using RxJava as the interactor. You're very close, and in a way you're kind of right. So this is actually how I think of RxJava. So for everyone listening, if you want a visual metaphor of RxJava, I talk about this in a video. Go watch that video if you're confused about RxJava. What's the video called? RxJava, the observer pattern on steroids. Essentially what RxJava does is it gives you like a pipeline between objects. Now, I don't use RxJava as the interactor, but rather the RxJava does become the pipeline. You're right. I use it as a pipeline between, say, presenter, use case, or interactor, to repository, to data source. Now, we can play with the definitions of use case and interactor, but what I'm saying is, yeah, I use RxJava as the glue between these layers, and it works very well because RxJava is fundamentally the observer pattern, and what the observer pattern does is it gives you like loose coupling between application layers and different classes, but it gives you extra tools to make it easier to handle things like concurrency. So RxJava, to me, that is essentially the one place where you really want to use RxJava is communicating between layers. You don't need to. You can use futures. You can use async task. RxJava is pretty friggin' awesome when you finally deal with how confusing it is, because it's hard to think about. Oh, someone's upset I didn't answer their question. All right, one more question, which is apparently a yes or no question. That's all right. Don't take it personally when I don't answer your question. Like, Christ, I'm just one person sitting here trying to make intelligible conversation about questions I don't generally get to prepare for. So, anyways, okay, Salim, what was your question? And then I will call it a day. I have so many questions. Okay. Okay, so you're asking a pretty specific UI question. So you've got a navigation drawer, and you use navigation view. So the question is, oh, so you want to be able to have a, okay, essentially what Salim is asking is, how do you create a navigation drawer slash view with like expandable menu items? Without using a list view or a recycler view. What I would, I'm just going to try and point you in a direction, but what I would kind of suggest is you're probably going to want to even like have a fragment represent the navigation view. It's been a while since I've thought about this because I don't actually often use navigation. I haven't recently worked with navigation view. Just give me one moment here. Navigation drawer. Yeah, I don't really, what I would be inclined to say, I don't have code handy that I can show you. I thought I did, but what I'd be inclined to say is you're probably going to want to basically treat your navigation view as a subview. So if you, and you might not be able to use the navigation view class specifically, you might have to just put like a fragment in your navigation drawer and then treat it just like a subview. But the thing is, that's a hard question for me to answer off the top of my head because I don't immediately remember what the limitations of navigation view are, so I can't really, it's not really a yes or no question. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on it. All right, so that's going to be all for today. Thanks for that, Cody. All right, so that's going to be all for today. Thanks for watching, and yeah, we're going to be doing this again probably next week, but if not, please follow me on Facebook. I don't spam with a whole bunch of stuff, but if you want to stay posted on what I'm doing, Facebook is the place where you're going to be able to do that. It's kind of the one place where I will always mention what I'm doing. And as I mentioned at the start of this episode, there's a chance where I might not be able to do certain streams between kind of now and April because I'm in the process of moving and a whole bunch of stuff is going on which I didn't get into. But I will try to keep doing this every Sunday, and as soon as my internet is back in working condition, I will carry on. But what I'm saying is there might be a brief period here where I won't be able to do the live stream for reasons slightly out of my control. So I'll try and avoid that, but yeah, it is what it is. Thank you so much. Hopefully you enjoyed my rambling. I know there was a lot of rambling today, but yeah, hopefully it was useful. Peace out.